Welcome to the special edition of The Big Picture. We have a very eclectic panel here today, and we will be talking about poetry, its relevance, its importance, whether it has gone away from our lives, how important it is, whether it has shrunk or not shrunk. So please welcome Mr. Anshuman Gaur, diplomat, writer, poet, Professor Saugata Bhaduri from the JNU, who teaches literature, Dr. Saif Mahmood, who is a lawyer at the Supreme Court and also a connoisseur of Urdu. Gentlemen, let me ask a very, very general question and then come down to the nitty-gritty of poetry. Tell me, do you think poetry is going away from our lives? Do you think it has shrunk? How relevant is it for us? Anshuman ji, please tell us.
Thank you, Rakhshanda ji. It would be a sad life without poetry.
Indeed.
So I certainly hope, and as a practitioner, that it is not away from us. We continue to keep the flag flying high. No, poetry has transformed itself from the rosy posy of the 18th century to something which is more meaningful today. It has translated into many styles, it has translated into many languages of expression. It's a broad field where there's a lot of experimentation going on. A lot of people are finding expression through poetry. A lot of meaningful poetry is coming on, especially from places like Nigeria and Africa, Egypt, even in India, many of the regional languages.
Yeah.
But I think my colleagues might have something to weigh in on that.
Professor Bhaduri, how difficult is it to teach poetry to young people?
It's not very difficult because in quite agreement with what was just said by Anshuman, I think that poetry hasn't shrunk at all. Maybe the medium has changed, maybe the modes of articulation would have changed. In any case, print is such an incidental medium. It was just invented a few centuries back.
Sure.
And in
it was
India,
recited, it was always an oral tradition.
Right,
also.
exactly. So again, through film songs, through music in general, and also through other media like the electronic media, the social networking platforms, etc., I see poetry very alive in today's young generation, and they can make an immediate connect as long as we, who are almost on the threshold of becoming old fogies, we change certain staid notions that we have about what comprises poeticity.
Sure. Dr. Saif Mahmood, you're a lawyer, you're writing a wonderful book collecting the poetry of Delhi. It's supposed to come out very shortly. But tell me, there has been this glorious tradition of lawyers and judges invoking poetry.
Yes.
And this was there. This was you know, quite a normal practice. Yes. Do you see poetry going out of practice, out of currency in your own work?
No, on the contrary, I think there's, if I can use the word revival, of the use of poetry in judicial work, in legal literature, etc. You're right, of course, poetry has always been used, and right from Shakespeare to recent poets.
You could impress a judge with a
you could impress a judge
clever turn of phrase. Yeah?
Yes, but it should, one has to draw a line somewhere now. I remember that we have Saugata here from JNU. When the president of JNU was arrested and the High Court granted him bail, the bail order began with "Mere desh ki dharti sona ugle ugle hire moti." Now these kind of overreaches, you know, judicial overreaches, when judges who are not well versed with poetry try and use it just to make a point, that is something that I am completely opposed to. On the other hand, surely the use of poetry in legal literature, in judgments and pronouncements of higher courts, brings those closer to humanity.
Sure. Saif, you're giving me a very easy and natural entry to my next question, again addressed to all three of you, which is this whole business of good poetry and pedestrian poetry. Yes. Now, there has been this notion of high poetry, which is classical poetry, and lyrics and so on. And there has been a tendency to look down on film lyrics. But I would argue that lyrics, geet, lok-geet, folk poetry, actually, in a sense, laid the stepping stone to an appreciation. You know, you had the simple poetry that you were taught as a child, and rhyme being an aid to memory. You knew how to sort of, you know, how a poem was constructed, you remembered poetry. So I personally don't see any reason to look down on lyrics, on geet, on folk poetry. Any take on this?
I don't think so. That's true anymore. With Dylan getting the Nobel Prize for his songs.
But again, that led to a lot of controversy. Whether a lyricist can be a poet?
Well, a lyricist is a poet.
Sure.
I would say a lot of poetry I do is lyrical. Sort of a contrarian thing right now in English poetry, but lyrics has always been part of poetry. Good lyrics is poetry, and there's no denial of that. And the controversy is more political, I think, than about the literary quantity or quality of Dylan's work. But with that done, a lot of counter movement has happened, especially in India, in Bombay film industry, for example. A lot of poets who were high poets
Sure.
have contributed to songs.
Oh yes, Sahil Ludhianvi, Kaifi
Absolutely,
Azmi, almost all the progressives.
And there's this whole body of literature, which, I mean, for a lack of better term, can be called Bollywood poetry, which is very rich, very diverse,
Yeah.
and
which reaches the nooks and crannies, the popular
absolutely,
imagination.
it does, and songs and lyrics have helped popularize poetry. It has helped keep poetry alive in every corner of India, at least.
Saugata, in the classroom, do you make a distinction between good poetry and not good poetry?
No, that is absolutely essential, but the distinction need not be generic, because part of the previous question that you asked presumes that there would be some kind of a prejudice against what would be
One or the
folk,
other.
what would be
Yes.
popular,
Yes.
vis-a-vis what would be branded
Yeah.
as high.
Yeah.
But there are good and bad poems in all these genres. So as long as we don't generically brand a particular genre as being bad, we are in for the aesthetic judgment that is absolutely required. So there are good film lyrics and there may be bad film lyrics, and therefore there is a need to, without going into the necessary distinction between what is pedestrian and what is high,
Sure.
go into that aesthetic judgment.
Saif, do you think simple poetry leads the way to high poetry?
Not
You
necessarily,
see it as
not
a
necessarily. But what I certainly think is, and that these young, and I'll give you an example. Last week I was invited to preside over a young poets mushaira.
yes,
I didn't know what I was getting into, because more often than not these young poets, especially I'm talking of Urdu, what they write can be at best termed as tukbandi.
yeah,
But I was pleasantly surprised that some of them were very good, and some poetry was very easy. But my point is that unless you read the classics,
yeah.
I don't think you would be able to write poetry, even understand good poetry. And as you said, without being prejudiced towards a particular genre of literature, there certainly is good poetry and bad poetry. Mir wrote some absolutely rubbish poetry, so did Ghalib.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they were not great poets in their own right.
Yeah. So, do you get a sense that people are in a hurry to be published? Whether it's prose or poetry for that matter, I see a lot of young people especially, it's like wanting to run before you can walk. So you need to read before you can write, surely.
Jatin Das gave a very good reply to this at the Dehradun Literature Festival recently. He said, when I started painting, I waited for 15 years to exhibit my first painting, because much as I was drawing and painting every day, I was not yet ready for an exhibition.
Sure.
Today, if there is one painting, it is exhibited.
So where does that filter come in? How do you filter and decide that, okay, this is print-worthy? Who decides for you? The poet himself? Mr. Gaur, what do you say?
A sensible poet knows what is print-worthy and
Sensible
what's,
poet sounds like a contradiction in terms.
what's not. No. A creation is like your child. All of them are your favorite. I'm sure Mir wrote good poetry and bad poetry.
And knew the difference?
And perhaps he didn't know the difference. Perhaps to him, the piece which later was called bad poetry was a better poetry.
Sure.
So it's not possible for a poet to be subjective or objective about his own creation. But then the test is reading. The more you read, the more deeply you are into expressions of others, that you find your own true expression within. And I started writing poetry when I was in my 20s. And I did not dare have it published till now I'm in my 40s.
Right.
So it's been 20 years of work, of constantly improving your own self. And like everything, poetry improves.
Yeah.
The more you work on it, the more you read. And I absolutely agree. You have to read the classics. You have to learn to walk before you run. Absolutely.
Professor Bhaduri, of all of us in this panel, you work most with young people. And do you think social media, which everyone has access to, most people we know are writing blogs or certainly writing long Facebook posts and so on, does this help or hinder? Because there is an absolute absence of any filter on social media. Anything that you write gets an audience.
Right.
The numbers may vary, but the audience is there.
Yeah. You can look at it both ways, because obviously not everyone who writes a blog or everyone who posts something necessarily gets as many hits as some others do. So within that media too, there would be some kind of a filter, some kind of a discerning factor in terms of reception. But that being said, I think the general suspicion towards the ubiquity of the medium is something that we have to probably partly do away with. But the bottom line still stays, because we were discussing two things here. One is that you cannot probably be a poet without already having some training, even if it's an informal training, into poetic practices, having read the great poets, having mastered the form, and form becomes very important. And the second is that probably judgment does lie in reception. So of course, because of the ubiquity of the social platforms and social media platforms, you can write whatever. So publishing is not very difficult anymore.
Yeah.
But the readers, in a way, the likes, in a way, will tell you whether you're making sense or not. And that would be a good touchstone.
Actually, just to answer, I know a lot of people who write absolute garbage on social media and get 620 likes in 1 hour. And you know, and also the other effect of the media, of the social media, is this. You will see, I think perhaps Faraz is the most misquoted poet.
I was coming to that. And poor Ghalib, I mean,
Ghalib, every, you know, such rubbish masquerades as Ghalib and Mir and Faraz and Faiz on social media, that is a great disservice, and nobody dares to correct them because nobody knows.
Nobody knows. Let's turn this discussion towards slightly troubled waters. This whole business of poetry and patronage. There's always been a link between poetry and patronage. It was the Raja Maharajas, the Talukdars, the Chota Mota Nawabs, and of course the Mughals and the others. And then it became the colonial masters who in their own way tried to guide what is good poetry, what is healthy literature, and so on and so forth. We have our apex literary bodies, not in the business of patronage, but they do patronize writers and poets by awards and so on. But what do the three of you think of official patronage? One that comes obviously with strings, which comes with do's and don'ts. Does that not muffle the poetic voice?
Like all arts, you need the rasik for the art to survive, to thrive.
True.
Same holds true with poetry. You need people who appreciate poetry. Good or bad can be a subjective thing, but you need people who read poetry, who appreciate it, who encourage it. In India, the official bodies, Sahitya Academy.
What if the Rasiks are mere holders of purse strings? What happens then?
Rasiks are the holders of purse strings.
Well, yes.
If they are merely holders of purse string, you have some sort of problem. But it's not limited. You know, with mediums such as television, printing becoming more accessible, more journals opening up. I mean, an Indian author can easily now send an entry into something like the Asian Poetry Review or even the Paris Review, New Yorker. So the field has become much wider. You are not constrained by what is available officially in India. I would, perhaps at a later stage, we can also look at the publishing aspect of poetry.
We will, of course, yes, we'll talk about that. We'll certainly talk about that.
Which is very important. And in India, it's opening up. It's actually a good time to be a writer or a poet, because there are more avenues available to you
than ever before.
So you're not beholden to official patronage, which might have been the case 20, 30 years ago. When, I mean, poetry in India was in its infancy, and I speak from the specific perspective of English poetry in India. But now there are more channels available, and I'm sure there are more channels available in other languages as well in India.
Well, there are, Professor Bhaduri, there are writers in residence programs and there are poets in residence, which even universities offer. I'm comfortable with that. I mean, that's all very well. But when we talk about institutional support, does that in any way, is it a troubling thing for you?
It is. But then the poet has to be duplicitous. The poet has to be subversive. Because without patronage, there can be no art. But then if you're only pleasing the patron, then you're not doing service to art, which is what you should primarily be doing.
Well, the worst of times are the best of times for poetry.
Yes. Exactly. So patronage or some kind of commercial, even if it's not governmental necessarily, even through sales or whatever, has to be there. But because without that support, one wouldn't survive. But in spite of that support, the poet has to serve the cause of somehow being able to stand up to normativity, somehow to be able to raise one's voice, somehow to be able to speak out the truth, however, let's say, bitter it may be. And the poet has to be duplicitous. And the poets are duplicitous. They do perform that duplicity fairly well. The good ones, for certain, do that.
Saif, let's talk a little about subversiveness. Is it not important for a poet to be subversive, to go against the grain? And then how do you sort of marry this with patronage?
Yeah, poets have always been under the patronage of somebody or the other, and also state patronage has had a major role to play in Indian poetry. It really depends on, as you said, the poet himself or herself. We had Saugata, who was under one or the other Nawab's patronage always. But he wrote such verses against the Nawab that nobody could have thought about. It's almost blasphemous.
Ghalib, who craved patronage all his life and yet managed to produce spectacular poetry.
And it's well known, that once Mir was standing with Nawab Shujauddaulah, and the Nawab asked him to recite something, and he recited, and the Nawab didn't pay attention, he was playing with his fish. So Mir said कि हुजूर तवज्जो दें तो मैं आगे पढ़ूं. Nawab Sahib said, well, हर अच्छा शेर मेरी तवज्जो का मुस्तहिक होगा. Mir went back, never came back to the Nawab, but at the same time, the Nawab did not stop his stipend.
Yeah.
And he met Mir on the street a couple of days later, and Mir just snubbed him. The stipend was not stopped. That is the difference. Today, if you do this, or even if you say something against the government, Faraz said, when Faraz was asked by General Ziaul Haq to either toe the government line or just get out, he said, उसे खबर नहीं तारीख क्या सिखाती है कि रात जब किसी खुर्शीद को शहीद करे तो सुबह एक नया सूरज तराश लाती है. These were the poets who could say this.
Yeah.
Today, I'm not so sure if we have poets who could, take the risk of annoying the government, especially the present regime.
The arts always provide enough leeway to the artist to mock his mentor.
Sure.
There is enough,
There's the image and the symbol and the metaphor.
Poem, Ozymandias.
Yeah.
The hand that mocked and the heart that fed.
Sure.
So it's there. Even when he was doing a statue of the greatest king, he was mocking him through his art. And that leeway is always available to the artist. For his sustenance, he has to at least put an appearance of towing the line, even if he does not.
Yeah.
No, there are artists today, there are poets today who are willing to push the boundary, and are pushing that.
Whether they will get government patronage under the current disposition or not is quite another issue.
That's another issue. But maybe is it the right time now for us to hear something from you? Would you like to read something from your forthcoming book?
Well, thank you for being so patient.
This, for the readers, his new book is out shortly. It's called The Isthmus of Time. Please read something from the new book.
This is a piece from the book. It's called Matinee. As dusk mops up the blood of a day not yet dead, in a lane that goes nowhere, your fingers slip from mine. We say our goodbyes, better unheard, better unsaid. In that cheap hotel room, the sheets dampened by our lust, beyond the wavy window panes, hangs the dust, rising from 1,000 tired feet. You sacrifice your breath to tell me what I almost knew. Noises from the street filtered through. We browsed through the shelves for the most ridiculous title. A stolen glance, a shared smile. You wore oversized shades, feeble attempts at anonymity. The move was not suicidal, but in defiance, you decided to take a stand, a brief but very public embrace. We were strangers in a strange land. It raised no eyebrows. Your laughter still tinkles when one opens the door of that old bookstore. The bridge between now and eternity, the narrow isthmus of time, a past without your thought, a future without your memory, just the burning now. We are not free not to decide, choose without a choice, a walk along the razor's edge. Don't be so dramatic, you say, as you turn back and with half a wave, drive to the airport for your flight. I take the next ferry out. It is over, we shall pretend. A story has no beginning or end. I would like to say that, in modern day India, the practitioner, the poet, is confident enough to be borrowing from a lot of sources without any hangover or any apology about it.
Sure.
So whether he borrows from Upanishad or whether he borrows from Greek philosophy or literature, it's just an art he's practicing. He's not constrained by either his post-colonial heritage or the fact that he's doing it in a language which is seen as an alien language in the country.
Sure. But let's also talk about whether this confidence that you talk about in the poet, the contemporary Indian poet, whether it is matched or whether it finds a reflection in publishing. Because there's a publishing truism that tells us that publishing poetry and selling poetry is very difficult. So what is the way out? Is self-publishing an option, publishing on a blog, finding a niche publisher, finding an e-publisher who will do poetry? Because conventional mainstream publishers will tell us that is difficult to sell. Did you have any such experience publishing this?
Well, I was lucky to find a publisher who was willing to go along with what I wrote. It can be intimidating, and there are more publishers now in the field than there were ever before.
That is because publishing itself is a booming industry.
Writers' Workshop was always there. There were a couple of other publishers who would want the poet to subsidize some of the work which was produced. But it at least allowed the poets to reach a bigger market or a bigger viewership for their wares. Rupa joined in the fray, advised by Nissim Ezekiel in the 80s, and that kind of opened the thing. And then also the poets establishing themselves internationally. Someone like Vikram Seth is totally unapologetic when he's writing about American feelings in American words.
Yeah.
He's just an Indian, but his writing is absolutely international.
Sure.
So those kind of people, this happened in novel a few years before it happens in poetry. But now I think Indian writers, Indian poets are accepted as poets, not Indian poet writing in English.
Sure. As a translator myself, I want to steer this discussion towards translating poetry, and I know Saif has translated a lot of poetry, and I'm sure, Professor Bhaduri, you teach poetry in translation. Do you work on the premise that there is an inevitability, there is an inevitable loss in translation, and you build on that? Is that something that you take into consideration?
The loss is given. In any case, there will be a loss. But I think the gain far outstrips the loss. The fact that one can access text from another culture, the fact that one can dabble in other cultural universes, that gain is much more than the loss that.
So the confidence that Mr. Gaur is referring to as a poet, does it find echo in you or in the translations that you do, that translators too are more confident?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the confidence that Anshuman was talking about also is a confidence of being able to blend the and the profane, not just borrow from multiple sources,
or different
but
sources,
borrow from Upanishads and talk about an extramarital affair.
Yes.
So this confidence is precisely what can metaphorize translation itself, the whole idea of leaping forth, going from one context to the other, not to fear this blending of what could be thought of as irreconcilable. So be it translators, be it academic practitioners, or be it poets, I see this new confidence, and I have sufficient reason to be optimistic about us getting beyond that kind of under the cloud of certain legacies alone and taking a bold step forward.
Saif, do you share this optimism?
Yes, I do actually. The only thing that I want to add is that the translator himself or herself must also be equally well versed in both the languages, one from which he's translating and the one he's translating into, and not just the grammar and the syntax, but also the societal milieu in which the poet had written what is being translated. and how it could be. For instance, I was translating fez, and there is there are just these two words there, aanchalon ki hina. I bet you can't translate this into English.
No, you can't.
Aanchalon ki hina. I don't even know what it means in
Jigger
Urdu.
for that matter. Yeah.
Yes. So it's very difficult. I've read some of your translations where you've left some of the Urdu words as they are. And they make perfect sense in that translation. So that is the confidence that we are talking about.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. It has been a pleasure talking to all three of you. And Allah kare zore qalam aur zyada.